Very, very good morning to you all. I don't know whether I've spoken with clarity, but that's nice to hear. You're quite right. So I'm a recovering civil servant, best way to think about it. So I genuinely think this is one of the best jobs that anyone can have, actually. So I'm the Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change. And we have this fabulous role. We were established 10 years ago by the Climate Change Act, in what I regard to be one of the best bits of legislation that Westminster have passed for the last few decades at least. It was the product of its age. I may return to that theme actually as we discuss it. But 2008 was when the Climate Change Act was passed. And this idea in the Climate Change Act that it was very important to, of course, reduce emissions and to have a long-term view of how to do that with the 2050 target, most obviously. But also this idea that that wouldn't be enough. And actually the UK has, I think, still one of the strongest frameworks for tackling emissions and climate change of any country around the world. And one of the reasons for that is that, of course, it has this long-term target, but also these interim targets that we call the carbon budgets every 5 years. And this independent body, us, which advises on all of those things. Our first piece of advice was actually on the long-term target itself for reducing emissions. And every 5 years we offer this independent advice on the interim target, and then we check the government's homework on whether they are making the right steps towards those long and interim targets. So far, that's worked very well. It's worked very well as a model, and it's also worked quite well here in the UK. We've been reducing emissions quite well. But I put it to you that we are at the moment now where it will be obvious whether this thing is going to work at all or not. And this is, of course, a UK concern, but also a global concern. And much of what I'll talk to you today about is the global issue and what we do about that. There is, of course, an alternative approach to climate change, which is that we need to accept it's happening and start adapting to it. And indeed, that's another part of our role. And indeed, if some of the things that we are seeing happen don't change, more of that later, that might be the sort of thing that I'm talking to you about in the future. I hope not, actually. But it's worth saying, just as at the outset, there is no free pass here. Things will change however we look at it and whatever we do. So there is a role for you, the community, and of course for government and policymakers in all of this in understanding that and doing something about it. So I think that's the thing I'll try and cover today. I want to try and cover some of the news of last year especially. For someone in my field, 2018 felt like a really important year. In particular the IPCC report, but a whole host of other things that went with that. We had the COP, as we know it, which is the moment each year when the world comes together and discusses climate change at the end of the year, and there was some really fascinating analysis that led up to that I might cover as well. So you really are key to what's next. I'm not just saying that because of the audience. The geological science supports nearly all of the major themes of the work to decarbonise here in the UK and around the world. I'm going to try and concentrate today on some of the kind of more fundamental questions in the science here, and just a handful of the broader themes. But I did have a look at the conference programme. I mean, you are covering it all. I mean, it's pretty obvious that this is a community that needs to be properly engaged with it. Do you feel engaged in your windowless room on day 2 of your conference? Well, I hope you do. So, and Happy New Year of Carbon, I should say, as well, which, of course, is... So 2019 really is going to be an important year, and I hope I can convince you that that's happening, that's how we feel about it, too. I mean, my aim this morning is to try and highlight the role of the subsurface as both the cause and part of the solution to this. So I'll do my best as a non-geologist to convince you. And Stuart's sitting in the front row there, so he will nod if I've got that right and shake his head if I haven't. So let us begin. I want to open really with the warts and all position, and a pre-warning that you need to be of a very sunny disposition to think that we are, things are looking rosy when it comes to climate change. It's big picture, where are we? If you can see that on this chart. We are now seeing very substantial warming in the observed data. And it's worth just beginning with that. 2017 was one of the 3 warmest years on record globally. And that's despite the fact that the temporary warming from the 2015-2016 El Nino had subsided. And we just got the 2018 data. We now know that 2018 was the 4th warmest year on record. There's a pretty clear pattern here We think a modest El Nino is now underway, so that's likely to be reflected in the 2019 average, which again will be a high one. So we are seeing warming now of around about 1 degree of warming since industry, and we can attribute some of the things that are happening in the climate system to warming at that level now. So I mean, just look at the kind of news reports about some of this. We'll come back to that later. And the consequences of that are, you know, we could spend a long time discussing that. But here's one way of looking at it. This is Arctic sea ice cover. We are now seeing those consequences. So again, I put it to you that this is the moment where actually this is no longer a thing that will happen. This is actually happening. We're starting to see this more and more in our climate system. We've seen this very pronounced rapid decrease in summer Arctic sea ice cover, which is one of the kind of key determinants that we look at. Long-term trend is about 13% shrinkage per decade. That's something that should trouble us as we look around. And more than that, the pace of change in the climate system is accelerating, sadly. Following several years where we didn't have growth in global CO2 emissions, well, that's all changed. So emissions grew in 2017, driven really by the economy, strong global growth, and crucially a return to global coal use. Which really is one of the key determinants of whether we're on track or not. 2018 saw a much stronger rise again, countries throughout the world contributing to that rise, again, thanks to the global growth in the economy as it's accelerated again. And it's worth just pausing on that. In 2008, I mentioned we're 10 years old, the committee is 10 years old. 2008, our first act really was to advise on what the appropriate level of the UK emissions target should be in 2050. And we did a load of work, which we are repeating at the moment, actually, to look at what was happening in the world with emissions and to ask the question, what should the UK's appropriate contribution be to that? And we came up with this idea that we should be reducing emissions by 80% from where they stood in 1990 by 2050. But when we did that, we looked around the world and we made some assessments of where we thought global emissions were heading. And actually, it's fascinating. I've been back reading some of that stuff since I started this job about a year ago. When we offered that assessment in 2008, we were confidently predicting that one of the kind of two scenarios that we looked at had global emissions peaking in 2016. And you know, that looks hopelessly naive now. That is absolutely not what's been happening. Global emissions continue to rise, and this continues to be a problem. Those higher rates of global emissions mean that cumulative emissions of CO2 are also rising faster. And this is the kind of key chart, if you remember anything. It's very important because as this graph shows, there is roughly a linear relationship between warming and those cumulative CO2 emissions, which you see here in the blue observation, if you can see that. Roughly linear. That has translated most recently into the idea, this is a controversial idea, that we have this idea of a dwindling carbon budget. If we care about those temperature targets that are enshrined in things like the Paris Agreement and its forerunners, then we should concern ourselves with the budget remaining of carbon. I have some problems with that because I think it leads to this idea that, you know, you can wait for a few years, or actually that something might come along to fix this. Actually, you need to do something about it immediately. But that carbon budget, that linearity gives rise to that concept of the remaining carbon budget to the temperature goals. And it was one of the reasons, I think, why the IPCC report last year about 1.5 degrees, this Paris Agreement, which enshrines within it the idea that we should be keeping temperatures to 1.5 or 2 degrees, depending how you define it. Well, that had a huge impact, much bigger actually than I think others were predicting. I was surprised by it. And while there's all sorts of uncertainty about what that carbon budget would be to reach that 1.5 degree threshold, it probably means we have, on current rates of emissions, we have between 10 and 20 years to get to that 1.5 degree threshold. And the other part of that report has said basically that, in summary, we should really care about that. There is a defined difference between a 1.5 degree world and a 2 degree world, which previously was the world that the world was targeting in its policies. And the crucial point that I want to make as a kind of first point in this talk is that remaining carbon budget is much, much smaller than estimates of the amount of carbon remaining as fossil fuel reserves or resources. And there are lots of really interesting ways of looking at that data. There's a really interesting group called Carbon Tracker who look at that. And we should worry about that. Because we now know that there is, in fact, more and more, all we know is that there is more and more recoverable fossil fuel reserves. And that makes that dwindling carbon budget look surprisingly difficult. The key message, I suppose, is that the extraction of carbon from the subsurface has been and will continue to be the key driver of global climate change. And crucially, warming will only stop when we either stop extracting completely or when we start sequestering 1 ton out, 1 ton back to try and reverse that. It's very simple. The science isn't that difficult. This is exactly what's happening, and we know it. We know we need to do something about it. What's fascinating to me is that people are beginning, I think, to wake up to that. One of them is Mark Carney at the Bank of England, who hasn't quite framed this way, but I might try and characterize it this way. This might well be the kind of global financial systemic risk that we've seen in the past. So basically, we are either overvaluing those companies with those assets on their balance sheet, or we are not investing enough in the task of adapting to climate change. And however you look at it, back to my earlier statement, that's something we'll have to address. And we may need to return to that idea of kind of mispriced assets when you think about the things that I'm talking about today. So that small remaining capacity for fossil fuel emissions is very important. It's basically the main task that we concern ourselves with in the committee. And the fact is that despite the very sharp decline in things like the cost of renewables and the growth in global generation that's come from those low carbon sources, the world is just about as dependent on fossil fuel energy as it was in the mid-80s. So basically, without very rapid changes to bring fossil fraction of that primary energy that we have in the world to zero, and rapidly, warming that we are seeing in the world will easily exceed those goals that you see in the Paris Agreement. That's, I think, a fairly uncontroversial thing to say. In fact, the last report from the IPCC made it clear that we're probably on track for about 3 degrees of warming, and that would be, you know, really troubling for the world. There are large parts of the world that will become effectively uninhabitable at that level, and we're already seeing warming at 1 degree causing those kind of effects in some parts of the world. So, I mean, the coming period is really the critical point, and this is really the point of me speaking to you today, that this is no longer a thing that's for the future. It is happening now, and we have to come to the point of addressing whether we're going to do anything about it. Think about this. The world's infrastructure is going to double over the next 15 years. The world economy will double in about, 20 years, thereabouts. That's the period over which the IPCC say we have to cut emissions by between 20 and 50% if you want to meet that 1.5 degree threshold. And if we don't act now, then we will lock in this fossil fuel paradigm, especially with that infrastructure provision, and there's no real way of reversing back from that. So there are a set of tasks ahead of us now which are not something the world has covered before and has addressed before. The kind of transition that we'll need to see has been done before. We can do these things at pace, but we haven't done it at the kind of scale that it's now required in the global economy. And that is something, therefore, that policy must address. And it is not going to be achieved by policy alone. This is something that especially the big corporates will have to address too if we're going to make it. Having said all of that, it's not time to slash the seats and leave the cinema. It's, there really is something that can be done about all of this. And there are, in fact, some reasons to be cheerful about it. And when we do the work that I'll tell you about in a second on net zero, this is something I want to return to, because often when people like me speak to rooms like this, it is a counsel of despair. And actually, I think the crucial thing for me is that this will not work unless you can couple up the very real and clear risks that there are here with an idea that there is something that we can do about it. And there are reasons to be cheerful. It is much, much, much cheaper to do the decarbonisation that we need than we thought. That is mainly a story of what we need to do with energy, and especially renewable energies, technologies. And if we look back over the kind of 10 years of the work we've been doing this, we were mega wrong 10 years ago about that fact. We had the kind of right idea about the UK economy, which is that you should decarbonise the supply of electricity and then electrify the economy as far as possible. And that's been the right strategy for the UK. But we were very wrong about how much that would cost. and especially how much it will cost in the future. And you see the kind of steep declines in price for some of the key technologies here. Solar is down about 80 to 90% in price over that period. Wind, I don't know, something like 60, 70%. The other one is batteries. These are the kind of key technology that we might need in the future. We have also avoided what we were on course for a few years back of about 4 to 5 degrees of warming. So we've done pretty well actually globally on that. Even our friend Trump in the US is failing to increase his carbon emissions at the rate he thought he wanted to. China too. There are good reasons to think that the world can get itself onto a different trajectory because we have already. But what's next is, of course, harder than the stuff that came before. On to solutions then, and let's get positive about it. I'm preaching, I hope, to an interested audience on this. We know that we need to decarbonise energy. We know that we need to decarbonise transport. We know more and more that it's possible to do these things, and it's cheap to do so. And especially if we go down that route of electrifying with renewable and other forms of low-carbon electricity generation, possibly nuclear, if you can ever finance it here in the UK. That's the usual discussion point for my talks. I'm not going to talk about that today. You will cover that, I'm sure, in spades over the next 3 days, or the next day and in yesterday's discussions. I wanted to talk to some of the wider issues for this audience that I wouldn't normally cover. And the key thing, I think, in terms of solutions is that we need to return some of that extracted carbon to geological storage. And that has long been a key component of what we in the Committee on Climate Change see as a necessary condition of the UK strategy. And I encourage you all to think about that and the things that you do in the future. In 2018, we returned pretty regularly, actually, to that theme in some of the work that we did, and especially at the tail end of last year. We produced 2 really important reports for me. Important because I oversaw them, so that's always a very important thing. But I think they're some of the best work we've done, actually, and as someone who's read these reports through the years. One on hydrogen and one on biomass, which looked at very dedicated and detailed reports in the autumn. And CCUS plays a role in both of those reports. Hydrogen first. We see hydrogen as an essential fuel for the future, and indeed something that needs to be developed now. It provides an answer to some of the questions that cannot be answered through any other means, especially when we look at what we think of as the hard-to-reduce sectors, like industry and like heavy goods for transport. And we looked at that issue late last year and asked the question about what could we do with hydrogen as a low-carbon fuel in the future. And one of the key issues we looked at is that while a number of low-carbon ways of producing hydrogen exist, their scale is pretty likely to be relatively limited. And this is one way of looking at that when we look at the carbon cost of that hydrogen supply. Our analysis found that gas reforming with CCS was probably the most likely source of that hydrogen, but that's not a free pass. So it's not in itself a zero carbon source of that hydrogen. So we need to think very carefully about hydrogen as an energy source in the future. It plays a really important role, and it is near zero carbon. In fact, there are some areas where it can be. But it meant that we didn't recommend a full hydrogen scenario in the future, and that was one of the more controversial things that we said last year, and clashed, I think, with some of the things that others around us expected us to say. And that's because we are cautious about the long future, and especially in a world when that target I've been mentioning here, the 80% target, might be a harder target in the future. We have to be super careful about having genuinely zero carbon sources for our energy in the future. So that led us to be slightly cautious about that hydrogen scenario. But hydrogen nonetheless offers this great thing that needs to be developed, and especially as a partner to CCS. So CCS, again, comes up in that report. CCS is also essential in the discussion of biomass, which was the other report that we produced very close, actually, to that hydrogen report last year in the autumn. We see CCS as essential to making biomass a success too, in efforts to decarbonise the global economy and indeed here in the UK. Sustainable and genuinely low-carbon biomass is a very valuable resource in the future. So in all of the assessments that you make in the 2050 world, biomass is a very useful thing. You can use it for lots and lots of purposes. It's therefore important to think about how you use it, and it's particularly useful if you can match it up with CCS. You hear often the discussion of BECCS, bioenergy with CCS. And that has this very important role potentially in the long future for decarbonising the global economy. And you see it written into all of the pathways that IPCC and others make in their assessment of the future. It's a hugely important technology. And it basically means that a large part of the benefit that we see from the use of biomass is the ability to match it up with CCS. And therefore, every use of biomass that doesn't match it with CCS is an opportunity cost. And that leads us to some of the more interesting conclusions from our report on the biomass report last year. For instance, we're not that keen on using it for aviation fuels because we can see better uses for biomass when you accompany it with CCS. It's worth saying, since we're on it, that some of those global pathways that you see discussed for for emissions reduction include fairly astonishing amounts of biomass in that energy transition. And I think it's worth saying that although we like biomass, and particularly when it's matched with CCS, we would like to, I think, pour some cold water over some of those assessments. There needs to be, I think, a very considered view, but realistic view of how we would use our land in the future alongside this. And one of the reasons we did the biomass report alongside a report on land use was for that reason here in the UK. And that brings us really to the question of whether the UK should do more. And I've been angling at this as this talk's gone along. We advised on that 80% target in 2008. And since then, the world has changed quite a lot. So we've already talked about the trajectory of emissions in the world. The other thing that we did was sign up to the Paris Agreement, which implies a harder effort. And we've been thinking about the appropriate moment to assess whether to translate that into a tougher UK target. We did this interesting dance with UK government last year, where we looked at the start of the year at their clean growth strategy, and we said, now is the moment for you to ask us a question about whether the target is the right one. And then Claire Perry, the Energy Minister, said, I agree, it is a moment to ask you a question, and we will ask you that question. And we said, thank you, that's great. I'm looking forward to being asked that question. And then in October, the question was asked, does the UK have the right target? And we welcomed that question. And we are now looking at this question of whether net zero can be achieved and by what date. Net zero, that is the 0%, that is 100% reduction in emissions, is already a government policy. It might not be enshrined in law yet, but it has been a stated government commitment, and I think you will find in Parliament very strong support for that at the moment. But the question of when we should reach it, and crucially how we should reach it, is one that we are now addressing here in the committee. So we are currently undertaking a piece of work to look at net zero and the question of how far the UK can go in reducing its emissions. And without spoiling the surprise, when we report later this year in the spring, we will say it is possible to go further, and you would expect us to say that. But of course that rests on an amazing amount of ambition that would need to be deployed in the form of government policy. That requires a political will that was there, I think, in 2008, and dare I say it, political consensus. And this is an odd time to be discussing political consensus, isn't it? So we'll be looking at what needs to be done. We'll be looking at the kind of policies that are involved in making that, and we've been making some assessments of, crucially, what's changed over the last 10 years to allow us to view how far you can go in the long future and by 2050. And I keep saying long future, it's not that far away. And especially since some of these concerns are infrastructure concerns, we need to get cracking immediately on it. We looked at this before. So when we signed the Paris Agreement, we did a piece of work in 2016, and we looked basically at what would happen in what we call our max scenario, and that's basically if you turn the dials up to 11 on every policy that we have in the UK at the moment. That's a Spinal Tap reference for those of you who are interested. But in that max scenario, we already see ways of getting beyond 80%. So this is our way of expressing that, if you can see it, but this is the kind of world in that max scenario that you might have. This amounts to slightly higher than 90% in 2050. And you will see, returning to my earlier point, that a substantial fraction of Beck's geological storage was assumed in this, along with additional contributions from land-based greenhouse gas reduction. And that basically offsets as much as the remains of emissions from other sectors, crucially things like aviation, which are very hard to offset. We're looking again at that, and there is some more evidence to say that perhaps we can go further than that. I don't want to kind of spoil the surprise. I'm not quite sure where we'll end up with it yet. But in 2050, it does look like there is more that we can add into that chart from the evidence that we've been gathering. And when you throw into the mix that it is becoming cheaper to do this, that becomes more and more optimistic, I think, in terms of what the UK can do to contribute to the global question. I'll make the point again, however, that CCS is pretty much essential. If you want to basically, you need to do all the other things. They're almost kind of preconditions of success. I was mentioning this to Stuart earlier. But CCS is the bit that you need to make sure that you cover off the remaining emissions. And it's hard to see us reaching 80%, never mind more than that, without it. And we've said that pretty consistently to government. Almost at the end. At the global scale, geological sequestration is also expected to play, of course, a really important role. The IPCC laid out a number of different pathways that the world might pursue to limit warming towards that 1.5 degree threshold. And short of implementing really ambitious energy demand reductions or kind of mega ambitious land-based greenhouse gas reduction, which they did look at, you'd need to convert land mass the size of India to forestry, along with vastly optimistic views on how we reduce energy to see a world where you don't have lots and lots of CCS. And that's what you see laid out in all of the pathways to 1.5 degrees by the IPCC. BECCS is shown here in yellow, and these are 4 pathways through it. It may well be the case that emissions don't fall fast enough to limit warming to beneath 1.5 degrees, and I would suggest to you that that's looking very likely at the moment, short of a big shift in policy from countries around the world. It may also be the case that the globe wakes up too late and decides it then has to reduce long-term temperatures in the future. And again, I'd put it to you, that's probably quite a likely outcome at the moment. In that case, the expansion of geological storage with greenhouse gas removals in the second half of the century is absolutely critical to bringing down those temperatures. And that's what you see in charts P3 and P4 there. This is what the IPCC looked at. And we talk about overshoot a lot in this field, this question of actually going over the temperature and then coming to our senses and coming back down. Well, in those worlds, you need a hell of a lot of CCS and you need a hell of a lot of BECCS as well to make that work. And that brings me to my last slide, which comes from our land use report last year. This is an infographic that we used. And I suppose it's a different take on the narrative here, which I wanted to kind of leave you with. Again, it makes the case that this community, your profession and mine, need to speak more and more and more regularly. Exchanges of carbon occur rapidly, are happening right now, between the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the upper ocean. So we know that. But it's only rapid in comparison to the kind of slow carbon cycle. And the slow carbon cycle removes from this rapid cycling the carbon to store it safely, in inverted commas, as fossil fuels. But that happens, of course, over millions of years. And I don't have millions of years, and neither does the populace living on the planet at the moment. So actually recarbonizing our landscape and the landscapes around the world is an absolutely critical part of the global response to the threat of climate change. And I hope that's something that you think about. Greenhouse gas removal through geological storage has the added advantage, it seems to me, of removing carbon out of this rapid carbon cycle. And as opposed to storing it in the land surface, where it can be much more easy, frankly, to put it back in the atmosphere if stocks are not maintained and if the policies that are required aren't there. We can be a lot happier that it is stored away in geological storage if we can put in place the conditions to make that happen. So I hope that's worth considering further as you go into the second day of this. And for me, that's a kind of added insurance policy that we're doing the right thing. And again, it points to the importance of CCS. And I think it is immensely important that government makes policy to address that and that we have the right corporate response to those policies in the end. We need to get moving on this, my final point. We'll report on that net zero question later this year. That's, I think, as important a report as we've ever done in the 10 years that we've been around. And I really hope it sets things up for the next stage of the UK effort. My very final point is that this, I suppose, throws into question that, whether the UK can be a leader on this at such a topical time, of course, about global leadership for the UK. I don't represent the government, just as you said. But I'd suggest to the government that here we have in the UK's approach to climate change, the perfect opportunity to demonstrate that the UK still has that global leadership credential. We're doing all right on it, actually, but the next stage really demonstrates whether we're serious. I really hope they do something about it, so I hope our report is the start of that. And I hope you'll join in that effort too. It's certainly a very exciting place to be working at the moment. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm sure there was plenty of clarity there. You're happy to take questions for 5 minutes? Mike's got the floor there. Yeah, one question right there. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Go.
Chris, you talked about global leadership, and clearly the only way we're going to avoid dangerous climate change is if the rest of the world does it. What do you think the best ways are for the UK to actually influence that process in the rest of the world? And do you think the government actually gets it, or do you think they just go, oh, we ticked our 2050 box, job done?
I don't know whether the government gets it. They certainly talk the talk, but I'm very pleased you asked that question, because it seems to me it's one of the key things. It comes up every time I speak. What's the point? You know, you could do everything and it wouldn't make a difference. And you know, of course, in terms of raw emissions, that is true. But the UK has already done a huge amount. It's worth thinking, maybe before I answer that question, about our historical responsibilities here. We are, I think, it's one of the key things for our report is we need to nail this. We are historically, per head of population, the worst polluters of any country in the world. The reason I can't say definitely that's the case is because the US might be about to overtake us, which is slightly annoying for the purposes of framing that report. But there's a historical responsibility, I suppose, to start with here that and crucially, we've reaped the benefits from that in the form of economic growth. So point one is we need to demonstrate that we have a historic responsibility to address that, but we need to demonstrate that there's an ability to continue to grow the economy in a zero carbon way. And that's what we've been doing, actually, fairly successfully. There are lots of people who say, of course, there's part of the reason that's been possible because we've been offshoring heavy industry, but there's a lot more happening than just that, and it's mainly an energy story. And the other part of what we've been doing alongside that is demonstrating how you reduce price for some of those key technologies. And that is a huge service to the rest of the world. And you see that especially in things like offshore wind, but also in a whole range of other technologies. And I would say that I mean, not to play to the audience here, but the CCS story is the other thing where I think we have a real opportunity to do something that is much bigger than the scale of emissions that we currently emit.
Let's get a couple more questions in.
John Midgley, British Geological Survey. What's it going to take for the government and the policymakers to realise the clock's ticking and we need to drill a hole somewhere and put carbon in it?
Well, I hope that when I make these impactful speeches that they listen, but I'm not sure that's enough, is it? I think there's I'm kind of off topic here, but I think there's an element of kind of seizing the moment, which was done in 2008 very well. There was a whole kind of trajectory that led to the Climate Change Act in 2008. And for those of you who remember, Nick Stern did his really important piece of work on the Stern Review on climate change. That led to, I'm going to put it this way, there was an excitement to tackle it in government around that time. And you saw that reflected also in the near full consensus in Parliament for the Act. I think that we need to find ways of re-injecting that kind of excitement into the discussion. And one of the reasons why I'm sure it's not the right way to do this, I'm sure it's not okay to simply talk about how bad this is that it won't happen unless there's a feeling we can do something about it. And we can do something about it, but it requires bold policy making, and if I might say it, a bit of vanity from the politicians. Someone's going to have to make their name on the basis of this. And I think the moment is here to do just that. And this is the kind of theme of my talk, is that we need to seize it this year, because these moments don't come along, all the time.
But this is what I've heard every year for the last 17 years, and nothing's changed.
Well, I would say a great deal has changed, actually, and I encourage you to look at the report when we produce it. I mean, globally, a lot has changed. We are not on the same trajectory that we were 15, 20 years ago, and that is because there has been policies put in place to do something about it. Here in the UK, a hell of a lot has changed. The story of the last 10 years has to shift. That's the key question. Can you move it off just decarbonising power stations into a host of things? And I agree with you, burying carbon in the ground is something that needs to have its moment.
Right, let's get 2 more questions in before we... Is there one here and one here? Stuart and someone else. Stuart, take yours first.
A slightly techie question, really. What do you mean by net zero when you, as a committee, talk about net zero? Is that CO2 simple?
We
CO2
will.
equivalent?
One of the key questions is that. So, and it's worth saying, this, depending how this works out, I can't be confident exactly what we'll say in that final report, but we asked the question about looking at CO2 separately from greenhouse gases as a basket in our call for evidence. And the science is fairly clear on this. Having a basket of gases which warm the Earth, of course those gases have different properties. And having an 80% target built around a basket of them kind of makes sense, actually. That's worked very well for us. When you get beneath that 80% level, or over it, depending how you frame it, that starts to make less and less sense. And in the end, what really matters are the long-lived gases. And there's a kind of question of strategy here. Every particle of CO2 we emit is effectively up there forever. That's the best way to think about it. We're there for millennia. That's not true of methane, for example, most obviously. And the quicker you reduce the CO2 emissions, the more you can tolerate methane emissions. So there's a kind of question of tactics and strategy that goes with this. But I suppose the other way of framing this is that unless you cannot claim as a country to end the contribution to global warming until you've ended your CO2 emissions. So that question of how we look at those gases is one of the really important ones for the report.
We'll take one more point and then we'll have to close.
Chris Oldsworth, Glasgow University. I was just wondering, you mentioned how some of the things that you did in 2008 were spot on, or more or less, and some were really not. I wondered, the UKCP, the Met Office UK climate projections that came out at the end of November, has that changed things much, or is it kind of in line with what you'd seen back?
It's a good question. I don't think I can answer directly. I can tell you that work is hugely important to us. So we have 2 sides to our work, actually. Well, the one I've been talking about today is about reducing emissions, is of course the one that we're known for. There's another side to work, which is how well adapted we are to changing climate. And the UK climate projections last year are really important. They don't talk about impact. So they talk about the change in the climate that's coming, and then we can translate that into a set of impacts and crucially put some risk around that. So that on that level, it's hugely important. But I couldn't answer the question directly whether we thought the same things were going to occur. What's obvious is what you can see written into that report, actually, that as Met Office and other scientists have developed their understanding, they have been surprised by some of the changes in climate that are happening, and crucially how quickly they're happening. So I'm feeling confident to say to you that things are happening more quickly and more rapidly than we thought they were 10 years ago, and that should kind of increase the urgency to do something about this.
Thank you, Chris. It was really great. So
Great,
thanks
thank
again. It's a real privilege for us to have you here. I hope in the year of carbon, this group of geologists will come up with some, if you like, some clear, specific recommendations as to how we could make those